Hello, in this video I'm going to take a look at how we can take our fork of the documentation site for Chocolatey and start running that locally on our own machine. And the benefit of doing this is that it starts us to allowing us to run the preview version of the site locally, so we can see exactly what our changes are going to look like before we submit them to the repository as a pull request. Now, in the previous couple of videos, we spoke about making changes directly to code via the GitHub user interface and then through github.dev. Now, those kind of changes, although they can be more complicated changes, especially when you're starting to edit multiple files at once, those kind of changes are really best reserved for small changes to the user to the documentation site, because as we make changes, we want to actually ensure that the rendered result looks the way we want it to. And that's where having the ability to clone the repository locally and to run the website locally allows us to see all the changes before we submit it. So that's the ideal. Now, I mentioned this in the previous video, but the reason that you want to start cloning it locally is because you're maybe making a larger change to the documentation website, and we absolutely want that. We encourage that. But the one thing that I will say is that if you are making a larger change to the documentation, I would request that you make create an issue in the repository. You get buy-in from the team, because we might be able to provide some information about, well, let's do it this way, or we think this is a good idea, rather than you going off and making lots of changes, spending lots of time to then ultimately maybe have to rework it, or have to maybe not be, or us not be able to accept that contribution. I want to try and limit that. So if you are wanting to make modifications that's above and beyond kind of a spelling mistake or a grammatical mistake or a minor addition to the website, I would encourage you to create an issue, get some buy-in from the team, and then look to making those modifications. The other thing I'd say, and I've said this in the other videos, is that we should always be working on a fork of the repository. So I have a fork, and my fork is over here at gep31/docs. So what I've done prior to coming onto this video, mainly just to save a little bit of time, is I have run a couple of commands. The one of interesting is the cloning of the repository. So I've cloned that repository locally onto my machine. I've then navigated into that folder. I've then set up a remote back to the original repository. So if I wanted to bring in the upstream changes into my fork, then I can do that via that remote. Then I've just made sure that the my fork is up to date with the upstream master. And then what I've done, because this is the first time I've run this on this machine, is I've run the setup.ps1 file. So if we take a look at that in the repository here, there is a setup.ps1 file, because there are a couple of applications that we need installed in order for the website to be previewed locally. So this first part of this is really just about ensuring that Chocolatey is installed, because what we're going to do is we're going to use Chocolatey to install the baseline applications that are needed for modifying the website and running it locally. So the first one is that we need to have the .NET Core SDK installed. In the first introduction video, I mentioned that the website is generated using a system called Static, and Static is built on .NET Core. So we need to have the .NET Core SDK installed in order to run it. Now, on top of that, where Static is taking the markdown content and generating it to HTML, we also make use of some Node libraries for some of the CSS and JavaScript elements that are on the page. So we also need to have Node installed, and then to help with the package management that we're using, we also make use of Yarn. So if you run that, Chocolatey will get all of those things installed. So what you're looking at here is the output of that. All of those packages and those dependency packages got installed. Now at the end there was a big wall of red text. I wanted to highlight that as it's not an issue. It's really just additional output from doing the installation of the Yarn package. Doesn't impact on anything, but it will be there. But as you can see, it succeeded successfully. And at that point, we should now have everything installed in order to run the website. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the website in my editor of choice, which is VS Code. So VS Code is going to be open. At this point, I've got the ability to start editing the files directly. So as I mentioned in a previous video, what we're going to want to do, or what we're going to want to make sure, is that we are working on a branch. So any changes that we're making, we should be making them on a branch, and that will help with the process of making any modifications that are required or suggested as part of that PR review. So you can either do that through Visual Studio Code, or if you're at the command line, we can do a git branch, git checkout -b, and we'll call this issue 64. I don't know if that's an actual issue on the website or not, but let's imagine that there's an issue called 64, or there's an issue with the number 64, and it has some changes that I want to make. And I've spoken with the team, I've said that I'm going to make these changes, and these are the things I'm going to do. I've got buy-in from the team, so now I want to start making them. So I've got my branch here, so if I just check, I'm on that issue 64 branch. Now I can start making some of those changes. But the first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the website is running correctly. And that's where the preview script comes in. So there's a preview.ps1 file. There's also a preview.sh file. And that's if you're on a Linux machine or a Mac, then you can run the preview.sh to get the same experience. Now, the reason this is failing is because having just installed the .NET SDK, it's not available in my current PowerShell session. So if I go ahead and close this PowerShell session, and I'll open it up again. That's the quickest and easiest way of doing it. If I cd back into that repository folder that I was in, so GitHub, Organizations, Chocolatey, and then Docs. In here, if I now run that preview.ps1 script again, what it's going to do is it's going to take all of those source files, so those markdown files within the input folder. It's going to read them all in. It's going to figure out all of the metadata that's associated with each of those files. It's going to create those as HTML files that are ultimately rendered to the output folder. And then what it's going to do is it's going to spin up a web server, and it's going to allow me to browse that site locally on my machine. And then on top of that, it's then going to watch that output folder, or that input folder, sorry. And then as I start to make changes to it, what I'm going to see in, I'm not going to say real time, because there is a kind of a build time that happens. It's going to take those changes, it's going to regenerate that output, and then it's going to update in the browser to show me what those changes look like. Now, what it's doing just now is it's doing the first part of the build. So this kind of the steps you're seeing happening here don't need to happen each and every time you run the preview. It's just because it's the first time that I've run that on this machine. It's taking down all of the yarn packages that we use. It's making sure that they're installed. And once it's happy, it will then execute a gulp task. So that gulp task is to take all of the JavaScript assets, the CSS assets that we have, and it's going to cause an error. So don't fully understand what went on there, but let's see if we can run that again and see if that doesn't just work after that. So let's cd into GitHub, Organizations, Chocolatey, Docs again, and then let's run that preview script one more time. That's not what I wanted to do. Let's do this. I have seen times where the yarn install doesn't always work. So let's see if it doesn't work the second time round. The reason I'm not too concerned about this is because, yeah, there we go. I'm reasonably confident that, or rather, we have a CI process that runs. So it's most likely something on my machine that was preventing that from working correctly. Some dependency that we don't really know about, but it's obviously some dependency that we don't necessarily need either. So running that preview script the second time got that to work. I might now have to go and dig into exactly what's happening there, so that that isn't the first time experience that you have when you build the website. So now that we've got past that part, so it's done the yarn install for all of the client-side dependencies that we have. It's run the gulp task, which is taking the JavaScript assets, compiling them, taking the CSS assets, compiling them, and putting them into the right folders. And at this point, it's now running static. So static is going to take those input markdown files. So while that's happening in there, It's this input folder and then the ENUS folder. This is where the core chunks of the website reside. So all of the top level pages are down here. So the frequently asked questions, the configuration page, and then the drill down sections where we start talking about the Chocolatey CLI or Chocolatey GUI, they're all within these contained folders. So what static's going to do is going to take all of those. It's going to look at things like in the metadata or the front matter of the markdown file. It's going to look at the order that it's contained within. It's going to look at things like if we've got any redirects in play from a previous version of that page to a new version of that page. It's going to look at the XREF that's created. It's going to take all of that information and it's going to stitch it all together to some coherent output that can then be viewed in the preview web server that we have. So this first time through, it does take a little bit of time because it's doing all of that work for us. The second time around, the build is actually going to be a little bit faster because Static does a great job in terms of caching some of that output so that it doesn't have to do it each and every single time we run the preview site. But it does take a little bit the first time round. But once it's completed, what we're going to have on the output is then going to show that the web server is now running, and it'll give us a link that we can take and put into our browser, and at that point we'll be able to see the site running locally on our page. So as I mentioned, the benefit of doing this approach is mainly due to the fact that we can see the changes that we're making. So rather than making a change that might have unexpected changes to the page that we didn't expect, or changes to the layout, or it just doesn't look right, the benefit of running it locally is that we'll see those things immediately, and then we'll know whether we're in a position where we can make that contribution back to the GitHub repository. So we'll just wait for that process to finish, and then we'll be able to open that in the browser. So let's just hold on just a second. So this is obviously a VM running on my machine. Now, if you've got a more powerful machine, this might be quicker on your machine. But where I am right now, I wanted to give a kind of a truer indication of what it takes to run this locally. So there we go. We're getting to a point where it's finishing up. The final part of the static process is to run some analyzers on the site. So if, for example, we had created an invalid reference to a document, then that will be highlighted in the output from the static execution. So we'll know if a cross-link between different pages wasn't working correctly. It will be highlighted as a warning and an error in the output. So again, that's just kind of saving us from ourselves when we're making changes to make sure that everything works as expected. So at this point, we are now running. So it's saying that I've got a preview server listing on localhost 5080, and then we are currently running in preview mode. So what that means is, if I go over here and open a new tab and paste that in, we've now got the locally running version of the documentation site on our machine. So it's the exact same one that is currently up on docs.chocolatey.org. The difference here being that I haven't enabled the cookie that says what my preference is in terms of whether I'm using the light or dark theme. But it is the entire site. So at this point in Visual Studio Code, I could start making changes. So let's, for example, just start making a change on the home page here for what is Chocolatey. So if I scroll down and I find the index.md, then here's that what is Chocolatey. If I come in here and let's say I make a change to say what is Gary. This is obviously a change that you wouldn't make or submit as a PR, but it's an example change. So if I go ahead and hit save there, what's happened in the background is that Static has identified that change has happened. It's then going to rebuild the site, and at that point, it's going to reload the browser with that change in play. So this is the benefit. This is the real benefit of bringing it down locally and having access to the preview script, because we get to see those changes in like I say, not real time, but certainly at that point where we're able to say, well, that change didn't do what I expected it to, I need to make a further modification. I get to browse it all locally, see it all locally, to then know that the PR that I submit back into the repository has a better chance of being succeeded. Now, what I will say is, as part of our process for accepting a pull request, I or someone else in the team will be running it locally to make sure that the site is doing or the change is doing what we expected it to. Now, I can't say I've seen that heartbeat took longer than that, so I'm not entirely sure what that output is. I haven't seen that. Perhaps that's just because I'm running on a VM that doesn't have the or it's taking longer than expected to. I might have to talk to Dave about that one. I'm not entirely sure what's going on there, but it's almost at the point where what should happen, it happened in the background there. So it has just refreshed this browser, and it's now taken that change, and it's now available on the site. So that was a change that I made in VS Code. We hit save, it regenerated the website, and it updated the browser to show us the change that I was making. So just to reiterate, if you are making a larger change to the documentation site, or you want to make a larger change to the documentation site, I would encourage you to first create an issue or pick up an issue that's already been created. Get buy-in from the team to make sure that this is a change that we would expect. Clone that repository locally, run that setup.ps1 script to get all the dependencies in play, then run the preview.ps1 or the preview.sh file. And then at that point, you're in a position to make some changes in your text editor of choice. I'm using VS Code here. You could be using something else. And then with that preview script running, you can then see those changes locally in the browser, make sure that they're doing what you expect it to then be able to submit a PR. And at that point, that's just your standard workflow. Create a commit. I said I was working on issue 64. Now, we would want you to create a fully detailed commit message to say what you did, why you did it, any additional information that would be helpful if we're looking back in the commits and in the history to know what was changed and why. So that's that. Hopefully this has been useful to you. This is the way of making a change that kind of a lot of work on your part, because it does involve cloning it, running the setup script, getting static running locally on your machine. So there's a little bit of work to get it all up and running. But we really do appreciate it because it is the best way in terms of knowing that the change that you're making has the best chance of being merged in at the end of the day. So if you've got any questions about it, feel free to reach out. But if not, thank you for listening. I'll talk to you later.